Scandal in a luxury store. A shy young cashier, Luis, is humiliated by Bruno, an arrogant bodybuilder, until none other than Conor McGregor intervenes. What did Conor do to put the bully in his place? How did Luis go from victim to hero? This story of bravery, redemption, and viral justice will leave you breathless. Don't miss it. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. Bruno pushed the store door open with more force than necessary. The chime of the bell was drowned out by the sound of his huffing. His jaw was tense, the muscles in his neck visibly strained. He had spent the last 20 minutes cursing his ex-girlfriend in his car. Now his frustration was looking for a new victim. His eyes scanned the place with disdain. Customers with money wasting it on overpriced clothes. Employees with fake smiles, waiting to serve anyone who would leave them a decent tip. It all disgusted him. Luis, behind the counter, swallowed hard. He adjusted his uniform with trembling hands. It wasn't the first time he had dealt with difficult customers, but Bruno had an intimidating presence. The guy looked like a tank on legs. "Good afternoon, welcome," he said, his voice weaker than he would have liked. Bruno didn't respond. He walked between the shelves with a grimace of disgust. He ran a thick hand over a leather jacket and scoffed. $8,000 for this? His voice boomed through the store. What's it made of? The skin of some idiot who actually pays these prices. Some customers glanced at him uncomfortably. No one said anything. Luis tried to focus on his work, scanning receipts and organizing the register. His fingers wouldn't stop trembling. He knew what happened when someone like Bruno walked into the store in that mood. He had seen it before. "Hey you." Bruno abruptly turned and pointed at Luis. "Who sets the prices here?" "You." Luis shook his head, feeling a knot in his stomach. "No, sir. I'm just the cashier." Bruno scoffed and picked up a random garment. "Tell me this doesn't cost what it says here. Because if it does, I need you to explain why people are dumb enough to pay for it." Luis opened his mouth but couldn't find an answer. Valeria, his boss, was watching from her glass office, but she made no move to intervene. "Nothing? Are you mute?" Bruno stepped closer to the counter, leaning over it. "Or maybe you're just slow." Luis felt his ears burn. His fingers gripped the counter. He didn't want to respond. He didn't want to make things worse. But Bruno didn't seem to have any intention of stopping. The murmurs in the store became more noticeable. Some customers watched the scene with morbid curiosity. Others avoided eye contact. Bruno smirked arrogantly and dropped the garment onto the counter. "Let's see how much they plan to rob me for today." Luis slides the invoice across the counter. His hands tremble slightly, but enough for Bruno to notice. The bodybuilder takes the paper, looks at it for a second, and his expression twists. "What is this?" Bruno growls, raising his voice. Luis swallows. "There must be a system error. I'll fix it right away, sir." "An error? You're overcharging me, idiot." Bruno slams his fist on the counter. A couple of customers turn to see what's happening. Luis tries to say something, but Bruno has already grabbed a card dispenser and throws it against the counter. The plastic crashes with a sharp noise. "Do your damn job right." Luis feels a lump in his throat. He wants to speak, but his voice gets stuck in his chest. His eyes search for help. Valeria, his boss, is a few meters away, arranging perfumes on a shelf. She doesn't look at him. A man in a suit, one of the customers, steps forward. "Hey buddy, calm down," he says firmly. "It's just a mistake, he's fixing it." Bruno slowly turns his head. His eyes lock onto the man like a predator sizing up its prey. "You stay out of this," he says in a low but sharp tone. "Unless you want to take this outside." The customer hesitates. His gaze drops for a moment. Then he turns around and pretends to examine a nearby display case. Luis looks back at Valeria. She still doesn't intervene. Her posture is tense, but she pretends to be busy. Bruno focuses on Luis again. Fix the damn invoice. He spits out the words. And you'd better make sure this doesn't happen again, or I'll show you what happens when people waste my time. Luis nods quickly, without looking him in the eye, and hurries to correct the mistake. He feels like his heart is about to burst out of his chest. But he knows this isn't over. Bruno grabbed Luis by the neck with one hand, lifting him partially off the ground as if he were a lightweight. His fingers dug into the young man's throat, who kicked unsuccessfully, desperately searching for support on the floor. The store fell into a deathly silence, interrupted only by the heavy breathing of those present. "You're useless," Bruno spat, his eyes bloodshot with fury. He squeezed harder, savoring the power he had over Luis. His muscles tensed, and for an instant it seemed like he would strangle him right there, in front of everyone. Luis tried to break free, but it was impossible. His trembling hands clawed at Bruno's arm, searching for any gap to escape. His vision began to blur. His chest tightened, and a relentless ringing filled his ears. His body hung in the air, barely touching the ground with the tips of his toes. Customers and employees watched with pale faces, trapped between disbelief and terror. No one moved. No one said anything. Valeria, Luis's boss, was present, but she made no effort to intervene. She stared at the scene, her lips pressed together and arms crossed, as if the situation didn't concern her at all. A murmur grew in the back of the store. A customer pulled out his phone and started recording. Another, seeing the screen light up, did the same. Several employees' hands slid into their pockets, hesitant between calling the police or simply documenting the abuse. The murmurs turned into a nervous buzz, but no one had the courage to act. Luis's eyes rolled upward. His skin took on a purplish hue. He tried to form words, but his voice was nothing more than a strangled gasp. Somewhere in his mind, he knew that if no one intervened, Bruno wouldn't stop until it was too late. Conor McGregor remained in the corner of the store, leaning against a designer clothing rack. His blue eyes followed every movement of Bruno, every gesture of fury, every word spat out in anger. It wasn't time to intervene. Not yet. Bruno still held Luis by the neck, his muscles tense, his jaw clenched. Luis struggled, but his strength was insignificant compared to the bodybuilder's. His feet barely touched the ground, and his face was starting to turn red. The murmurs grew among the customers and employees. No one did anything. Conor crossed his arms and narrowed his eyes. He measured the distance between Bruno and Luis. He noticed a detail others didn't perceive. Bruno's hand was trembling slightly. It wasn't a tremor of effort, but of insecurity. A small crack in his aggression. A weak point. From the other end of the store, someone saw him. A middle-aged man in an expensive coat and a watch that reflected the ceiling light tilted his head and whispered something to his companion. The name Conor McGregor floated in the air. Another customer heard it. Then another. The whispers spread like a silent wave. Some raised their phones, their cameras focusing on both Bruno and Luis, as well as the imposing figure of Conor, who remained motionless, waiting. Bruno, blinded by his own rage, didn't notice the change in the atmosphere. He didn't see the phones recording him, nor did he perceive that the crowd was no longer just watching the altercation. Now, many were looking at Conor, waiting. They wanted to see what he would do. Conor uncrossed his arms. A slight movement. A warning. Bruno didn't know it yet, but his time was running out. Conor McGregor uncrosses his arms and steps forward. His gaze locks onto Bruno, assessing him. For a moment, the bodybuilder doesn't react. His grip on Luis's neck loosens slightly, just enough for the young man to collapse to his knees, coughing and catching his breath. "And who the hell are you?" Bruno frowns as he notices Conor's relaxed demeanor. His tone is mocking, but his stance shifts slightly. Conor doesn't respond. He simply tilts his head and flashes a smile that doesn't show his teeth, a smile that conveys not friendliness, but confidence. Then he lifts a hand and, with a slow gesture, motions him outside. The provocation is clear. Bruno lets out a dry laugh. "Are you challenging me?" His tone is a mix of disbelief and ridicule. He pounds his chest with his fist. His physique is imposing, every muscle tense beneath his tight-fitting shirt. "Look at you. I could tear you in half without breaking a sweat." Conor still doesn't answer. His smile widens just slightly. There is no rush in his movements, no anger in his eyes, only certainty. Finally, he speaks, his tone low and controlled. Outside, Bruno grunts. He's not used to being challenged like this. Intimidation has always been enough for him. But something in Conor's gaze unsettles him. Even so, his pride won't let him back down. "All right," he says, raising his hands in a mock gesture of surrender. "Let's give these spectators a good show." He fully releases Luis and gives him a light kick in the side, not hard enough to hurt him, but enough to humiliate him. Luis curls up, still coughing. His eyes shift from Bruno to Conor, filled with a mix of confusion and awe. The murmurs among the customers and employees grow louder. Some exchange incredulous looks, others pull out their phones. One of them, a man in sunglasses and a leather jacket, leans toward the woman beside him and whispers, "Is that Conor McGregor?" She blinks, surprised. Then, she looks at Conor more closely. Recognition spreads quickly through the crowd. The luxury store, usually a sanctuary of shopping and elegant silence, turns into a hive of anticipation. People begin moving toward the exit, some with nervous smiles, others holding up their phones. The air fills with excited murmurs. Luis, still on the ground, tries to get up. His throat burns, but his mind is sharper than ever. He watches Conor with a new perspective. He doesn't look angry or agitated. He looks completely in control. And that, for some reason, makes Bruno even more tense. Conor turns on his heels and walks toward the exit. His posture remains relaxed. He doesn't rush. He doesn't look back. Bruno snorts and follows him, with the confidence of a predator. He doesn't notice how the tension in the room has shifted. He doesn't understand why the crowd is no longer looking at him with fear, but with anticipation. Luis swallows hard and, still unsteady, leans on a counter to watch as both men disappear through the door. He doesn't know what's going to happen out there. But for the first time in a long while, he feels that maybe the bully is about to know fear. Bruno kept his fists clenched, his jaw tight, trying to hold on to the aggression that had driven him this far. But something had changed. The murmur in the store grew. A customer, almost too afraid to raise their voice, whispered the name. "It's Conor McGregor." Their companions' eyes widened. The fighter. The word spread like wildfire. Bruno realized it. He looked around. People holding up their phones, recording. Their faces no longer reflected fear or submission. There was a different kind of expectation in the air. The confidence that had driven him this far began to crack. His mouth was dry. He swallowed. Cold sweat dripped down his back. Conor, arms crossed, watched him without hurry. There was no fury in his eyes, only an air of absolute certainty, as if he already knew how this would end. Bruno let out a tense laugh, trying to regain his composure. "This is ridiculous," he said, shaking his head. "What's the point of fighting a retired fighter?" No one laughed. Not a single customer. The silence was worse than any response. Bruno took a deep breath, trying to appear unfazed. But his legs weren't as steady as before. His confidence was crumbling with every passing second. Conor tilted his head slightly. He raised an eyebrow, made a small gesture with his hand, as if inviting him to keep talking. Bruno had no more words. Bruno turned on his heels, intending to disappear into the crowd. His jaw was tense, and his muscles, which had once seemed imposing, now felt heavy. But before he could take another step, he felt Conor's icy gaze piercing into his back. He stopped dead in his tracks. "Not so fast," said Conor, his voice sharp and firm. The murmurs in the store died down. Everyone was waiting. Bruno swallowed hard. Conor took a step forward, never taking his eyes off him. His expression showed no anger, not even satisfaction. Just determination. A silent command. "You're going to apologize," said Conor. "Here. Now." Bruno felt heat rising to his face. He wasn't used to taking orders, much less in front of so many people. His instinct screamed at him to defend himself, to fight back, but his mind told him otherwise. Conor's name still floated in the air, and everyone's eyes were on him. There was no escape. "I'm sorry," Bruno muttered, not even looking at Luis. Conor raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. The silence grew heavier. "That won't do," Conor said without moving. "Do it right." Bruno clenched his teeth. His knuckles turned white from the tension. He could feel the stares drilling into the back of his neck, the phone still recording. He forced himself to take a deep breath. He turned again, this time looking at Luis. His lips parted with effort. His voice came out firmer, but still tinged with pride. "I'm sorry, Luis." Luis said nothing at first. His breathing was still unsteady, his body trembling slightly. But in the end, he nodded. Not for Bruno, not even for Conor, but because, for the first time in a long while, he felt that fear no longer controlled him. Bruno lowered his head. He knew this wasn't over. But for now, he had no other choice. Valeria slid her finger across her phone screen, selecting the video with a determined gesture. Without hesitation, she uploaded it to all her social media accounts with a brief description. Conor McGregor puts a bully in his place. Within minutes, notifications began to explode. Likes, shares, comments. The avalanche of reactions was unstoppable. In less than an hour, the video had spread like fire in a dry field. Thousands of people were commenting on it, sharing it in groups, tagging friends. "This guy thinks he's invincible until he meets someone real," wrote one user. "What a disgrace to the bodybuilding world," posted another. Bruno went from being a symbol of arrogance to an icon of ridicule. Meanwhile, the brands that sponsored him started taking notice. One by one, they removed his image from their official accounts. Without warning, his inbox filled with curt messages. "We regret to inform you that we have decided to terminate your services." His world, built on a facade of strength and confidence, was crumbling. Bruno felt the blow when he checked his phone. His follower count was plummeting. Every time he refreshed the screen, hundreds disappeared. His face tensed. His hands were sweating. He took a deep breath and decided to act. With trembling hands, he typed a post on his social media. "This is all a misunderstanding. You don't know the full story." He hit post and waited. The comments came quickly. "Full story? There's nothing else to see," responded one user with hundreds of likes. "You're a coward. Stop making excuses," wrote another. His attempt to control the narrative had failed. No one believed him. The humiliation was complete. Bruno threw his phone against the table. The dull thud of the impact echoed through his empty apartment. His tense muscles were powerless against reality. His public life was falling apart, and he had no way to stop it. Luis took a deep breath. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked at Valeria, who was reviewing some papers at her desk. He had to do it now. "I want to quit my job," he blurted out suddenly. Valeria looked up, surprised. Luis swallowed and continued. I want to dedicate myself to graphic design. It's always been my dream, but I never had the courage to seriously pursue it. Until now. Valeria's expression changed. First, disbelief. Then, something deeper. Something Luis didn't expect, pride. Are you sure about this? She asked in a calm voice. Luis nodded. His hands were trembling, but his gaze remained steady. Valeria studied him for a moment before leaning back in her chair. It's a big decision, she said. And a risky one. Luis didn't respond. He knew it was true, but he had spent too much time letting fear dictate his life. Then Valeria smiled. If this is what you really want, you have my support. Luis felt a wave of relief. He hadn't expected that. Before he could thank her, Valeria continued. I want to see your work. Luis blinked, confused. My sketches? Yes. Show me what you've done. Let me see if you have what it takes. Luis pulled out his sketchbook and opened it with trembling hands. Valeria leaned forward, examining each stroke carefully. She flipped through the pages slowly, saying nothing. Luis felt his stomach tighten with every second of silence. Finally, Valeria looked up. You're good, Luis. Really good. Luis felt the tension leave his body. You should showcase your work in a gallery, Valeria added. I know someone who could help you. Luis squinted. Are you serious? Absolutely. I have a friend who organizes exhibitions. I could put you in touch. Luis could hardly believe what he was hearing. For years, he had dreamed of something like this, but it had always seemed out of reach. Now, suddenly, the opportunity was right in front of him. What do you say? Valeria asked, crossing her arms. Luis took a deep breath and smiled for the first time in a long while. I say it's time to try. Conor checked his phone. The comments, the messages, the public's response, everything indicated that what he had done with Bruno had resonated with people. But he knew this couldn't just be a single incident. There were too many Luises out there, too many victims of workplace harassment who had no one to stand up for them. He had to do something bigger. He called Luis that same night. I want you to be the face of a campaign, Conor said bluntly. Luis remained silent. His breathing became faster. Me? He asked in disbelief. You have the perfect story. People need to see that anyone can stand up to harassment and move forward. You are proof of that. Luis felt a knot in his stomach. The idea of exposing himself that way terrified him. But at the same time, something inside him ignited. An opportunity like this didn't come every day. I'm in, he finally said. Recording the video was harder than Luis expected. Sitting in front of the camera, with the lights pointing at his face, he felt like every word took twice the effort. But then he thought about everything he had been through, the humiliation, the fear, the helplessness. He remembered the moment Conor stepped in and how that changed everything. He took a deep breath and began to speak. A few weeks ago, I was a victim of harassment at my job. It wasn't the first time, but it was the last time I stayed silent. Someone helped me realize that I didn't have to accept that treatment, that no one should accept it. The words flowed more easily now. Luis recounted what had happened, how he felt at that moment, and how his life had changed since then. When he finished, the room fell silent. Conor nodded in approval. That was perfect, he said. Luis wasn't so sure. He felt vulnerable, exposed. But when the video was published, the comments started pouring in. Not only did people support him, but many also shared their own experiences. The video exploded on social media. Within days, the campaign gained unexpected momentum. TV shows and digital media began talking about the issue. Luis started receiving emails, messages, calls. They wanted interviews. They wanted to know more about his story. The first interview was on a radio show. Luis arrived nervous, his hands cold. Conor patted him on the shoulder before he went in. Speak from the heart. People will notice. When the microphone was in front of him, Luis felt an emptiness in his stomach. But then he remembered all the messages of support. He remembered the people who told him that his story had given them courage. And he spoke. Bruno wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his forearm. The gym where he worked now was small, no frills, without the blaring music and constant admiration he once enjoyed. He had gone from being the center of attention to a mere employee in charge of cleaning the equipment. A customer approached the counter to buy an energy drink. Bruno felt their gaze fixed on him before hearing the words that made him cringe. "Is that you?" The guy from the video with Conor McGregor. The man smirked mockingly, not bothering to hide his disdain. "You ran off like a scared kid." Bruno avoided eye contact. He grabbed the bottle the customer wanted, placed it on the counter, and rang it up without saying a word. He no longer had the arrogance to respond. There was nothing he could say. His humiliation was public. The man took his drink and walked away, but Bruno felt the stares around him still fixed on him. His fists clenched against the counter, but he did nothing. He was no longer the guy who could intimidate anyone. Not after that. Later, as he cleaned one of the weight machines, he heard muffled laughter. Two young men were talking near the entrance. He didn't need to try hard to understand what it was about. And there he was, facing McGregor, trembling like a kid, said one, laughing. The other turned slightly and nodded in his direction. "Look at him. He looks like a dog with its tail between its legs." Bruno tensed his shoulders but kept cleaning. He couldn't do anything. If he reacted, it would only make things worse. But inside, the knot in his stomach tightened. Someone approached from his side and stopped in silence. Bruno didn't need to turn around to notice the presence. He recognized it immediately. It was the gym's oldest trainer, a burly man with a face weathered by years of experience. "If you're just going to lower your head and take it," the trainer said firmly, "you'll never change how they see you, or how you see yourself." Bruno frowned, unsure if that was a criticism or an opportunity. "And what am I supposed to do?" he asked bitterly. "Hit them?" The trainer shook his head. "No. But you can show them you're not the same guy from the video. If you really want to change, feeling sorry for yourself isn't enough. You have to work for it." Bruno looked at him for the first time. The trainer had no mockery in his eyes, only determination. "I'm going to train you," the man said. "But on one condition, not just to strengthen your body, but also your mindset. This isn't about others. It's about you." Bruno didn't respond immediately. For the first time in a long while, he felt like someone wasn't judging him, but offering him a way out. He took a deep breath and nodded slowly. The trainer smiled with a barely perceptible gesture. "Good. Then let's get started." Luis adjusted the last frame on the wall and took a step back. The gallery was ready. The spotlights illuminated his designs with precision, highlighting every stroke, every color. He could still feel the tremor in his hands, but it wasn't fear. It was anticipation. For the first time, the world would see his art. Outside, a line of people waited for the event to open. The promotion on social media had been a success, and attendance promised to exceed his expectations. But what comforted him the most was seeing Conor McGregor among the crowd, chatting with Valeria. Both had given him the push he needed to get here. Inspiring others with his story and his work was the next step. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A message. Luis read it twice to make sure he wasn't imagining things. "I'm Rodrigo Fierro, art critic. I saw the promotion for your exhibition and will be there tonight. I look forward to seeing your work." Luis swallowed hard. Fierro had a feared reputation in the art world. His opinion could elevate a career or mercilessly destroy it. He felt a knot in his stomach, but there was no turning back. His only option was to give his best. He turned toward the entrance. Valeria watched him with a smile that offered him calm. Conor gave a thumbs up from a distance. The doors opened. People entered with curiosity. Luis observed every reaction. Some stopped in front of his pieces with expressions of amazement. Others took photos, whispering among themselves. A couple of reporters walked through the gallery with cameras and notepads in hand. In the distance, he recognized Fierro. The critic walked slowly, hands clasped behind his back, analyzing each piece without showing any emotion. Luis felt his pulse quicken. He forced himself to take a deep breath. He was no longer the young cashier for months ago. He had faced fear before and had overcome it. Now he had an opportunity, and he wasn't going to waste it. Conor McGregor stood at the center of the stage with the confidence of someone who had seen and faced too much in life. He took the microphone and scanned the room. The murmuring among the attendees faded within seconds. They knew he was about to say something important. "We all know Luis's story," Conor began, his voice firm yet approachable. "A young man who was once humiliated, who felt fear, who was on the verge of giving up. But instead of doing so, he rose. He didn't just defend himself. He turned that experience into a reason to fight. And look at him now." All eyes turned to Luis, who tried to smile, though his heart pounded. He had never been the center of so much attention. Not like this. Not for something positive. Conor paused before continuing. "What Luis shows us is that standing up to injustice is not just an act of personal courage. It's a spark that can ignite a fire of change in the world." Applause broke the silence. First a few, then the entire room. As Conor spoke, several people pulled out their phones and started live streaming. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Within minutes, Conor's speech began circulating on social media. Luis's story, his struggle, his exhibition, everything became the topic of the moment. Comments flooded the live streams. People from all over shared their own stories of overcoming adversity. The exhibition, which Luis had envisioned as a small event, was now being talked about by thousands. Luis looked at Valeria, who smiled at him with pride. Then he turned his gaze to Conor, who was now calling him onto the stage. His stomach tightened, but he didn't hesitate. He walked to the center of the stage and took the microphone Conor handed him. For a moment, he felt all the air leave his lungs. But when he spoke, his voice was clear. "I never thought I would be here," he began. "For a long time, I convinced myself that I wasn't enough, that what I did didn't matter, until someone reminded me that I had a choice, that we all have a choice, to stay in fear or move forward despite it." The audience remained in absolute silence, absorbed by his words. "I don't want anyone to go through what I went through. But if you ever feel like the world is crushing you, remember this. There are people who will support you. You are not alone. And above all, never let anyone else tell you who you are or what you're worth." A burst of applause filled the room. Luis took a deep breath and smiled. For the first time in his life, there were no doubts in his mind. He felt proud of himself. Bruno swipes his finger across his phone screen, checking his latest post. A video of his training, showing his strength, his discipline. He wants to prove he's still standing, that he's not the villain everyone thinks he is. But the comments aren't long in coming. "Aren't you the guy who almost hit a cashier? Stop pretending. No one believes you. Now you want to play the victim?" Bruno clenches his jaw. He deletes some comments, but more appear. No matter how hard he tries, the shadow of the viral video keeps haunting him. His follower count has plummeted, and his reputation is in ruins. Maybe he'll never clear his name. Maybe it's already too late. He stares at the invitation to Luis's exhibition on his phone screen. Part of him wants to ignore it, pretend it doesn't matter. But something inside him forces him to go. When Bruno enters the gallery, he feels all eyes on him. It's not paranoia. Some attendees recognize him, whispering among themselves. He runs a hand over the back of his neck and moves through the exhibited works, feeling out of place. Luis is in a corner, talking to Conor and Valeria. Bruno gathers his courage and approaches. Luis sees him first. He tenses for a moment, but doesn't back away. Conor crosses his arms, watching silently. Valeria keeps a serious expression. "I want to talk to you," Bruno says, his voice lower than usual. Luis exchanges a glance with Conor and Valeria before nodding. They walk to a more secluded corner. Bruno takes a deep breath. His throat feels dry. "I want to apologize for real," he finally says. "Not because of pressure, not to look good in front of anyone. What I did was wrong. I can't change what happened, but I can try to be better." Luis watches him. There's no trace of fear in his eyes, only a calmness Bruno didn't expect. "I believe you," Luis says after a long silence. "But apologies aren't enough. You have to prove you're better." Bruno nods, swallowing hard. He expected rejection, but Luis has given him something he didn't think he'd receive: a chance. After his conversation with Luis, Bruno stays at the gallery. He walks among the paintings, observing each stroke. He doesn't understand much about art, but there's something in Luis's works that makes him stop. Each piece seems to tell a story of struggle, of transformation. He feels a connection, though he doesn't say it out loud. When he's about to leave, someone approaches him. A young man around 20, with the hood of his sweatshirt up. "I saw what happened at the gym," he says, not looking directly at Bruno. "I know you tried to apologize." Bruno braces for the insult, the mockery. But it doesn't come. "I'm not saying everyone will forgive you," the young man continues, "but it's good that you tried." Bruno blinks. It's not absolution, but it's not condemnation either. It's the first time someone has given him a sign that maybe the path to redemption isn't completely blocked. As he walks away from the exhibition, he feels something different in his chest. It's not relief, not yet, but it's a start. The exhibition had exceeded all expectations. The venue, packed with attendees, vibrated with the energy of those witnessing something unique. Luis, standing next to Valeria, observed his piece titled "Courage in the Face of Fear." Each brushstroke represented a moment of struggle, of contained terror, of courage forced by circumstances. Now his story was public, and with it, the voice of many who had never dared to speak. Conor stepped onto the stage. The buzz in the room faded into an expectant silence. He raised the microphone and, with the same authority with which he had confronted Bruno in that store, said, "Luis taught us something many forget. True courage is not measured in muscles, but in the ability to rise after falling." He paused, scanning the crowd with his gaze. "That's why, in honor of his bravery and that of all those who have been victims of abuse, I will donate to organizations that fight harassment. Applause is not enough. We must act." The audience erupted in cheers. Luis felt a lump in his throat. He had never imagined his life would change like this. He felt Valeria's hand squeeze his and closed his eyes for a second, engraving the moment in his memory. The next day, his phone didn't stop ringing. Emails, direct messages, proposals. Designers wanted to collaborate with him. Companies were reaching out to turn his illustrations into advertising campaigns. Galleries invited him to exhibit his work. Each offer brought him closer to what he had always wanted. Luis opened one email in particular. It was from a well-known clothing brand that wanted to use his art for a special line. His hands trembled as he typed his response. Yes. Finally, a yes without doubts, without fear. Meanwhile, Conor posted a short but powerful message on his social media. Change doesn't come on its own. We build it with every action. My commitment is clear. Part of my earnings will go towards supporting victims of workplace harassment and creating safe spaces for everyone. In less than an hour, the post had hundreds of thousands of interactions. Luis's story was no longer just his own. It had become a symbol. If this story moved you, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss more inspiring content. Share this video with friends and family who need to see stories that challenge perspectives and leave an indelible mark. Explore our channel to discover stories that inspire and transform. Until the next video. That night, Luis and Valeria walked through the city, enjoying the fresh air. "Do you think this is real?" he asked, still in disbelief. Valeria smiled. "It is. And it's only just beginning." Luis looked up at the sky, took a deep breath, and nodded. He had started as a simple cashier with a dream. Now he was an artist, a fighter. And for the first time in his life, he was ready for whatever came next.